Would you let me know, what do you see right now? Do you see the full PowerPoint? I want to make sure we're on the
Yeah.
same page. Is it full
Yes.
screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can see civil resistance and we can see it just fine. At least I can.
Excellent. Very good. Well, I want to share a little bit of how I got to be so interested in civil resistance, because it connects to the work that I do as a priest, as a pastor, as well as to the work that I have done in the public square. So 4 years ago yesterday, my neighbor in Pasadena, California, was killed by Pasadena police. J.R. Thomas was a Black man, a father of 8 children, and he called the police for help when he had a mental health crisis. They came to his home and tased and beat him to death. The response of the community immediately was a series of vigils and protests. And my friend Andre Henry, who's an activist and artist with whom I went to seminary, saw that these protests needed to be sustained over the long haul to keep the attention of this injustice at the forefront of the public consciousness and on the steps of the institution that brought about this pain to the community. And so we looked to the Pasadena Police Department, where we ended up building memorials to JR. And what started as an organic, spontaneous eruption of emotion and a desire to bring this lament to our community, and especially to the institution of the police and our local government, turned into a weekly liturgy that we called a subversive liturgy. We would light candles and pray. We would lay flowers and bring posters. We would chalk words of hope, words of lament. And we did this, we committed ourselves to doing this for a year's time. And as the year progressed, we realized that we wanted to be more disruptive, but we didn't quite know how to do that. We realized that the police were really able to brush us aside. We were maybe a nuisance at most. And so that led us to reading about civil resistance and to begin to immerse ourselves in this robust tradition of disruption, of liberation. And so what I want to do today is, again, to connect the dots between what many of us know as a social practice to something that is also deeply rooted in our tradition, that is deeply rooted in our scriptural tradition throughout the Hebrew and New Testament texts. So this is going to be a whirlwind as I connect some scriptural texts to some basic principles of civil resistance. We will have some time afterwards for Q&A. But do know that this is a whirlwind. I just finished teaching a 5-week class on this, and that felt like a whirlwind. So just hunker down with me. But I hope that this will be informative and helpful for you.
Amanda? Amanda?
I want to begin with one of my favorite stories in the scriptures. These two characters get a really quick moment in time, a moment in the spotlight. Shifra and Pua. You may not know their names, but their story appears in the first chapter of Exodus. These are the Hebrew midwives. In fact, they're probably people from North Africa because of their names, but people who were deeply connected to the community of the Hebrew people. And we find in the first chapter of Exodus that these women are unwilling to trade their values and their relationships for compliance with the status quo. Pharaoh asks them to kill every Hebrew baby whom they help to deliver. And the text tells us that the midwives don't do this because they feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So they disobey the orders of the authoritarian. And then these women do something exceptional. They double down on their disobedience. When Pharaoh asks them what happened, why didn't they kill the boys? They lie. And they lie in this glorious way that dignifies who the Hebrew women are. They say to Pharaoh, the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They're vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. And so the text tells us God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. This is one of the first examples we have in the scriptures of people blatantly disobeying the powers that be. And I wanted to start from here because obedience and disobedience are at the foundation of the status quo. Obedience undergirds the status quo, and disobedience, and I say faithful disobedience, is the way in which we have the power to overturn authoritarianism and the status quo that authoritarians want to maintain. But that's not an easy thing because people obey for a lot of reasons. So here's a few reasons why people obey. And if we can begin to understand the psychology, the reasons why we obey, then perhaps we can also begin to actively choose disobedience when, as Dr. King said, an unjust law, which is no law at all, needs to be disobeyed. So the first reason that people obey is simply habit. We grow up learning to obey parents and teachers, religious leaders. We're taught that this is simply the right thing to do. And so in order to break this habit, we have to constantly remind ourselves to stop. Self-interest. Oftentimes obedience is rewarded with money and jobs and social status. Fear of sanctions. I call this the 3 Ds. People are afraid of being detained, disappeared, or dead. And so the fear of physical punishment is not only on the people who the 3 Ds happen to, it's also the people that they love. There's a real fear of physical repercussions. The zone of indifference. This is about apathy and staying out of trouble. If the midwives had decided, we really don't want to mess with Pharaoh, we don't want anything to happen to us or to our families, they wouldn't have shown up in the story. The story would have played out very differently. Absence of self-confidence. This is something that happens over the course of time. So as people are under an authoritarian ruler, someone who gaslights, someone who is constantly telling them that they have no power, that they are worthless, this develops a lack of self-confidence where people believe that they can't do anything to change the status quo. Moral obligation. This is often reinforced by our theology that tells us that the laws that are in place, the government that is in place is to be obeyed. And also people often believe that if a law is in place, that's for the good of everyone. If it's good for me as a white person, for example, it must be good for everyone. It must be good for people of color. Psychological identification with the rulers. This one is one that I think is playing out powerfully right now. This is about thinking that you're just one spell of luck away from becoming a billionaire, from becoming a person in power. And it's especially potent when you mix racism into it, white supremacy into it. There's a lot of myths about being able to achieve the same status as those who are ruling. Superhuman factor. This has to do with people attaching a godlike character to the ruler. Majority behavior is about the pack is going along with it, so I might as well just run along with the lemmings off the cliff. So again, with Shifra and Pua, we see that they are responding with disobedience in ways that break down a lot of these different reasons that they would have had to obey. The fear of sanctions for them especially would have been a real threat to their well-being. But instead they choose to be actors of history and not to let history be written for them. So here's another story. We see Vashti in the Esther story setting off a domino effect of disobedience. Her story, I think, often gets overlooked in the Esther story, but I think it's a vital beginning to that story because the way it begins is with Vashti refusing to comply when her husband, the king, invites her to come before all of his drunken friends to be objectified, to be the object of beauty and admiration and perhaps other ways in which she may have been harassed. So she refuses to show up, and we know the story, which is that she gets deposed as queen. And the interesting thing about this story to me is what happens with the king in conversation with his advisors. The king's advisors say to him, "This deed of the queen will be known to all women, causing them to look with contempt on their husbands, since they will say, this name is a challenge. King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she didn't come. This very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's behavior, will rebel against the king's officials, and there will be no end of contempt and wrath." Can you imagine? I love this moment in this story because it is so clear that this one woman, failing to comply with the status quo, failing to obey, when she withdraws her compliance, there is a ripple effect. And it looks a little bit like this. So the traditional view of power is that power is monolithic, that it cannot be moved. It's like a pyramid, that if you try to push it from the bottom, it's immovable. But the social view of power has a different story to tell. And I think this is the story we see play out in the Esther story. The social view of power says that those at the top are held there by pillars of support. So in the case of Vashti and King Ahasuerus and all the people in their land, women make up one of these pillars of support. We see the king's advisors freaking out because they believe that Queen Vashti, withdrawing her support from this pillar of women who hold up the patriarchy by their compliance within it, in part, that other women will also continue to engage in that non-compliant behavior. They will be rebellious toward their husbands, and that the system of domination that the king depends upon won't be able to stand if this one pillar is withdrawn. Within our own system, those who are in power also rely on pillars of support. So some of the pillars within our own society include the police, the military, the educational system, religious institutions, churches. It includes the business community. It includes the bureaucracy, local governments. And this understanding of power is important because it hinges on the belief that when one pillar is wobbled, the whole thing begins to be more fragile, begins to be easier to topple over. So within civil resistance theory, the idea is that you don't target the strongest pillar, which, side note, tends to be the police and the military. They're the ones who are least likely to withdraw their consent from the status quo. But if all these pillars are upholding the status quo, let's say an authoritarian regime, you can target other interests within that pillar. And we've seen that play out recently with the protests that resulted after the murder of George Floyd. The business community was one of the first pillars to go. Pretty quickly, you saw businesses that you never would have imagined having any need to weigh in on the question of white supremacy, making very clear their statements against white supremacy. And also some companies even beginning to make changes to the way that they operate institutionally. And so we began to see that pillar wobble. Power is made possible not only by coercion, but by the consent of those who are ruled. And so there's ways in which all of us participate in different systems, different pillars, and we can withdraw our consent from those, right? So there's general strikes that can take place in which we are withdrawing our consent to participate in the economic system as it stands. Religious institutions can withdraw their support, as we saw after 45 did his photo op in front of St. John's, and then Marianne Buddy came out and publicly made a statement about the fact that as bishop, this was her church and not his, that she has the authority to decide what happens on the premises of that church. So a lot more to be said here, but we'll keep clipping along. I want to talk a little bit about the three principles that undergird a successful movement of civil resistance. And those are vision, planning, and discipline. The first, vision. The example that I want to share here is of the Beatitudes, because I think that Jesus was a far more subversive strategist than he's usually given credit for. In the Beatitudes, we see Jesus painting a vision of a world that could be, a world in which those who've been marginalized and left out, those whom the system has thrown away, are the ones who flourish, right? And so we know these verses well. Blessed are the poor, those who mourn, the meek, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Jesus paints a vision of what the world will look like when justice reigns, when God's justice has the final say. And not only is Jesus painting a compelling vision of tomorrow, he's also doing it with a subversive tactic. He's making a public statement, which is an affront to those who are ruling. So there's really two things at play here. So we see the strategy that's at play here in this pyramid. This comes from the Center for Nonviolent Action and Applied Strategy, the organization that was started by folks who overthrew Slobodan Milosevic, the dictator of Serbia, in 2000. They now run an organization that trains nonviolent revolutionaries around the world. And so this pyramid takes a look at the trajectory of planning a nonviolent movement. And you see that vision is at the top. So vision is about casting a clear picture for where we want to be. Isolated tactics, like let's say a mass protest, might achieve some movement. There may be some movement achieved sometimes because people get really lucky. But one of the things I've learned from Srđan Popović, one of the alumni from Otpor in Serbia, is that there are two kinds of movements: successful and spontaneous. And so a successful movement is one that begins deeply rooted in a place of vision. Why? Because we need a positive vision that can give us the hope that we need to make our way through the slog of the chaos caused by those who are ruling over us with oppression and injustice and violence. We need something that's going to give us hope. And as preachers, this is a key role that we can play. I think this is the role that Jesus plays in the public sermons that he gives to huge crowds. He is doing the work of casting a vision for what could be that compels people to make it through the day. And not only to make it through the day, but actually to live as if something else is possible. Then we have strategy. First, there's the general strategy, which is about how are we going to win what folks in this tradition call war without weapons. How are we going to win? General strategy primarily is about selecting the strategy of nonviolent discipline, which I'll talk more about in a second. Then we have strategy, which put quite simply is how will you use what you have to get to where you want to be? How will you use what you have to get to where you want to be? So it's making an assessment of your resources, making an assessment of what the risk factors are, what the resources are that your opponent has, and being able to make really strategic choices about where you're going to direct your energy. So as I said, police and the military are often targeted, but they are the strongest pillar in most societies. And so strategy is about looking at where is the most vulnerable pillar and can we direct our energy there? Then we have campaigns. Campaigns are an ecosystem of tactics. They're about choosing tactics that can be escalated up as you go. So it's not just saying, we're going to run out to the streets and we're going to do a public protest. It's about saying, if that tactic doesn't get the attention of the powers that be, how do we escalate that tactic by doing something else, something that is more disruptive? And then finally, you select your tactics, which are the steps that are going to help you win your campaign. So a little bit about nonviolent discipline. We see in the story of Jesus' arrest, when Peter cuts off the ear of Malchus, that Jesus takes the ear of Malchus and he puts it back on his head. And he tells Peter that famous line, "Put away your sword," right? I think this is a moment where Jesus recognizes a fundamental principle of civil resistance, which is that we can make oppression backfire when we are committed to being nonviolent. First of all, it's important to note that the other side is always going to have all the swords. The folks who are willing to use oppression and injustice against those who are vulnerable are always going to be the ones who are willing to have stockpiles of swords. So it is not strategic to use weapons. This is important for me to say to a group of clergy, because I think clergy often come at the tradition of civil resistance from the idea that love of neighbor is a good thing. And that is not compelling to a lot of people whom I know, right? That is not compelling to a lot of people who have been out in the streets since June, who are angry, who want to see the system change and are not seeing it changing. So what is important for me to share with folks who are not going to buy into principled nonviolence is to be able to talk about strategic nonviolence. And the truth of strategic nonviolence is that it is actually twice as effective as violence in achieving its ends. And one of the reasons is this, that nonviolent discipline can make oppression backfire. Why? Because when you see an army of swords coming at you, and you are swordless, as Jesus and his friends end up being once Peter puts his sword back away, it is very clear who the aggressor is and who those who are fighting for justice are. So that can be made very clear through the media as they are documenting it. One thing that Sergio Popovich always says is, as soon as one person in your ranks chucks a water bottle, all bets are off, right? In terms of the story that is told by the media. So commitment to nonviolent discipline is able to make oppression backfire by making your cause sympathetic to those who may be deeply afraid of violence, who perceive what is happening on the streets as violent. And finally, after unity and discipline, we have planning. We see Jesus send out the 12 in the book of Matthew with very specific instructions. And what strikes me the most about these instructions is that he specifies whom they are to go to. He tells them, go nowhere among the Gentiles, enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. As you go, proclaim the good news. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. You received without payment, give without payment. Take no gold or silver, copper in your belts, no bag for your journey, or two tunics or sandals or a staff, for laborers deserve their food. Whatever town or village you enter, find out who in it is worthy, and stay there until you leave. As you enter the house, greet it. If the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. But if it is not worthy, let your peace return to you. I'm struck by this passage because I think here Jesus is being deeply strategic. So planning and strategy are synonymous here. Jesus is commending his disciples to go to very specific people. There's a strategy at play here. In the tradition of civil resistance, there is a spectrum of allies, and there are different approaches for how you engage with different people on the spectrum of allies. So on the far end of the spectrum are the people who are active opponents, right? Those who are seeking to uphold the status quo using violence, using violent rhetoric. Then you have your passive opponents. Then you have those who are neutral, who are just kind of apathetic, who aren't engaged. Then you have your passive allies, and you have your active allies. It strikes me that in the Jesus movement, those to whom the disciples first go, in the book of Acts, we have a shift and the movement broadens. The disciples first go to those who I would categorize as passive allies. So these are the people that in your movement you want to first seek to win over. Interestingly, this is not what we do, at least in the parishes I've been a part of. There is a lot of work that goes into trying to persuade people who are on maybe that even the active opposition or perhaps the passive opposition. But what happens here is Jesus begins by commending his disciples to build their movement by going to those who will be most persuadable. And then, of course, the movement grows as it draws in people from a broader and broader spectrum. So there's a lot more to be said, but I wanted to stop with this last slide for Q&A. This is a photo from Charlottesville. I'm not in this picture, but I was there later in the day. And this moment was seared in my memory and was triggered again this week at the debate. The same feeling I had when this president said that there were good people on both sides was triggered for me when I heard his comments at the debate this week. And what I want all of you to know, and what I want all of us to lean into, but I long for us to lean into, is the knowledge that it is not hopeless, that we can come together as people who are deeply committed to the gospel, that there are time-tested ways of resisting that are deeply rooted in our tradition, as all the clergy in this photo were well aware, that allow us to come together using nonviolence to wage war, right? To wage war without weapons against those who would demean and destroy beloved children of God. So I thank you for your time. And I believe now we have a few minutes for some questions.